When the millionaire pointed at the barefoot boy and laughed, betting 10 million he couldn't play, no one expected what came next. That piano would expose secrets money couldn't bury and shatter a rich man's pride forever. The chandeliers of Whitmore Manor hung like frozen waterfalls of crystal, scattering golden light across the grand ballroom. Tonight, 300 of Sydney's most powerful people gathered beneath that glittering display, champagne flutes catching the light as laughter echoed off marble walls. It was the event of the year, the celebration of James Whitmore's billion-dollar development deal that would reshape the Sydney harbour skyline. In the centre of the ballroom stood a Steinway Model D grand piano, black as midnight, polished to a mirror finish, utterly untouched. The guests knew better than to approach it. That instrument carried a history no one dared mention in the presence of the master of the house. James Whitmore moved through his guests like a shark through still waters. At 54, he possessed silver-tempered hair and eyes that held the kind of coldness that made bank managers stammer. His bespoke Italian suit cost more than most Australians earned in 6 months. Self-made, the business magazines called him. What they never printed was how many families lost their homes to his developments, how many small businesses crumbled so his towers could rise. Margaret, his wife, floated beside him in a designer gown dripping with diamonds. She smiled at everyone, but her eyes remained empty. 23 years of marriage had produced one child, one tragedy, and nothing but silence between them ever since. The party followed its choreographed rhythm. White-gloved waiters served canapes worth more than a week's groceries. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Executives laughed too loudly at James's jokes, desperate for any crumb of favor, everything absolutely perfect. Until the service door creaked open. A small hand appeared first, pushing against heavy wood. Then a face emerged through the gap. Enormous brown eyes, wide with uncertainty, dark hair falling across a forehead damp with sweat. Oliver was 9 years old, but life had made him look smaller. Hunger had sharpened his cheekbones. Worry had carved shadows beneath his eyes. He wore a t-shirt that had once been white, now grey with a tear at the shoulder. His jeans bore patches at both knees, and his shoes were so worn that the sole gaped open at the front. He was looking for his mother. Grace had taken the extra cleaning shift tonight because they'd promised good pay, and God knew she needed it. The rent was 3 weeks overdue. The electricity bill sat unopened because opening it meant facing numbers she couldn't afford, and the medicine cost more than she earned in a fortnight. But without it, the pain became unbearable. The shift was running long, and Oliver had grown frightened. His mother wasn't well. She pretended to be fine, always pretended, but he saw everything, saw her gripping the wall when she thought no one was looking, saw her closing her eyes against waves of dizziness, heard her crying softly at night, so he did what any worried child would do. He left the small service room where he was supposed to wait and went searching for her. The problem was he'd pushed open the wrong door. Oliver took 3 steps into the ballroom before realizing his mistake. His eyes went wide at the overwhelming display of wealth. He'd never seen anything like it. The chandeliers looked like frozen diamonds. The floor was so polished he could see his own reflection staring back, a shabby ghost among all this gleaming splendor. And the people, every single one of them, was now staring at him as though he were an insect that had crawled into a display of rare orchids. The silence spread like a wave. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter cut short. The string quartet stopped playing when they realized no one was listening anymore. Every eye in that ballroom fixed on the poor boy standing frozen in the middle of the marble floor. Oliver felt his face burn. He wanted to run, but his legs had stopped obeying him. He stood paralyzed, a rabbit caught in the headlights of 300 judgmental stares. A woman in a red gown covered her mouth in disgust. A man with a silver beard wrinkled his nose as though detecting an unpleasant odor. Whispers began circulating through the crowd like poison. Who let this in? Where did this urchin come from? Where on earth is security? James Whitmore turned to see what had interrupted his perfect evening. When his eyes found Oliver, something flickered across his face. Not compassion, irritation, as if someone had spilled red wine on his new carpet. He walked toward the boy, his Italian leather shoes making firm, deliberate sounds against the marble. Each footstep fell like thunder in the silence of the ballroom. Oliver tried to step backward but stumbled over his own broken shoes. He nearly fell. Several people laughed. James stopped 2 meters from the child. He looked him up and down, examining every detail of that miserable figure, the filthy clothes, the destroyed shoes, the dirt beneath fingernails that clearly hadn't seen proper soap in days, hair that obviously hadn't met a comb in a week. "Who are you?" James's voice sliced through the air like a blade. Oliver swallowed hard. His voice came out thin, trembling. Sorry, sir. I'm looking for my mum. She works here. Grace Sullivan." "The cleaner?" Oliver nodded, shame flooding his cheeks with heat. James let out a short laugh, utterly devoid of warmth. "So the cleaner's son decided to take a little stroll through my party." He turned to address his guests, spreading his arms theatrically. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we have an unexpected guest." Laughter rippled through the ballroom. Oliver felt his eyes sting with tears he refused to let fall. He'd promised himself he wouldn't cry, not in front of these people. Margaret glided over to her husband, adjusting her diamond necklace. "James, darling, just have security remove the boy. He's leaving marks on my marble." More laughter, more humiliation. Oliver took a step backward, ready to flee. That was when his eyes found the piano. The Steinway seemed to glow under the chandelier light, its black surface reflecting the room like liquid obsidian. It was the most beautiful thing Oliver had ever seen in his entire life. Without thinking, his feet carried him 1 step closer to the magnificent instrument. James noticed the boy's gaze. "What's the matter, boy? Never seen a piano before?" Oliver didn't respond. He remained mesmerized by that magnificent instrument, unable to look away. Something cruel passed through James's eyes. An idea. A way to transform this embarrassing interruption into entertainment for his guests. He snapped his fingers and pointed at Oliver. "Oi, kid, you like my piano, do you?" Oliver finally tore his eyes from the instrument to face the man in the expensive suit. It's really beautiful, sir." "Beautiful?" James walked to the piano and ran his hand along the gleaming top. "This piano cost more than you and your entire family will ever see in your lifetimes combined. It's a Steinway Model D, handcrafted in Hamburg. There are only a handful like it in the whole of Australia." Oliver didn't know what to say. He just stood there, looking. James turned back to his guests with a predatory smile forming on his lips. "You know what? I'm going to make our young visitor here a proposition." He fixed Oliver with eyes that glittered with malice. "Boy, do you know how to play piano?" Oliver hesitated. His mind flew to his grandfather, to those afternoons spent in the grand homes of the wealthy where Pop would tune their pianos, to stolen moments when small fingers pressed forbidden keys while his grandfather kept watch at the door. "A little," Oliver murmured. James laughed. Margaret laughed along. The guests followed like a chorus of hyenas. "A little," James repeated, wiping an imaginary tear from his eye. "The cleaner's son knows a little piano. This is absolutely priceless." The businessman then moved closer to Oliver. So close that the boy could smell expensive cologne mixed with champagne on his breath. "I'm going to make you an offer, boy." James's voice dropped lower, theatrical, cruel. He was enjoying this. He loved these games, putting people in impossible situations and watching them drown. "If you sit down at that piano bench and play a real piece of music, not some rubbish like Happy Birthday or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, I'll give you $10 million. Right here, right now. I'll transfer it to your mummy's cleaning lady account first thing tomorrow morning." The entire ballroom held its breath. $10 million. It was an absurd amount, unreal. The kind of money that would change any ordinary person's life forever. More than Grace Sullivan would earn. if she worked every day until she died, more than Oliver's entire family had seen across generations. Margaret's eyes widened. "James, have you lost your mind? Relax, darling." He didn't take his eyes off Oliver. "It's impossible. Look at him. He probably can't even read. He'll sit on that bench, bang a few random keys, and we'll have the best laugh of the evening." He turned to his guests. "Anyone want to bet how long he lasts before he gives up?" The wagers began circulating through the crowd. 30 seconds. 1 minute. Someone declared he'd start crying before he even sat down. Oliver stood motionless. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his own ears. He looked at the piano, looked at James, looked at all those mocking faces waiting for the show of humiliation. He thought of his mother, working herself to exhaustion to keep them alive, hiding her pain, hiding her illness, hiding her terror that she wouldn't be able to go on much longer. He thought of his grandfather, Pop, who never owned a piano of his own, but who made other people's pianos sing for 50 years, who taught his grandson in secret, in stolen moments, whispering that music belongs to no one and everyone, that it lives in those who know how to truly listen. He thought of all the times he'd played in train stations, sitting on a milk crate with a broken toy keyboard missing 3 keys, collecting coins for his mother's medicine, while commuters rushed past without seeing him. Oliver drew a deep breath. His feet began to move. The ballroom grew even more silent, if that were possible. The guests watched in fascination as the ragged boy walked toward the $1,000,000 piano. Margaret gripped James's arm. "You're not actually going to let that filthy child touch the Steinway, are you?" James ignored her. He was having far too much fun to stop now. Oliver reached the piano bench. It was upholstered in black leather, probably softer than any bed he'd ever slept in. He ran his hand across the material, feeling the smoothness against his calloused fingers. He sat down. The bench was too high for him. His feet barely reached the pedals. But that didn't matter. He knew how to adapt. He'd always known. His hands hovered over the keys, 88 of them. Black and white, perfect, waiting to be played. James crossed his arms, smiling in anticipation of the disaster about to unfold. Margaret had her phone raised, ready to film. The guests pressed closer, forming a semicircle around the piano. Everyone wanted a front-row seat to the moment when the poor boy would fail spectacularly. Oliver closed his eyes. For an instant, he wasn't in the mansion anymore. He was in his grandfather's tiny flat, with the smell of fresh brewed tea and the sound of rain drumming on the tin roof. Pop was beside him, calloused hand resting on his grandson's shoulder, gravelly voice whispering in his ear. "The music's inside you, boy. Let it out." Oliver opened his eyes. His fingers touched the keys, and the first notes of Clair de Lune by Debussy began to float through the ballroom. The sound was crystalline, pure. Each note spilled into the air like drops of liquid light. Oliver's fingers moved with a confidence no one had expected. There was no hesitation, no error, only music, the most beautiful music that ballroom had ever heard. James Whitmore felt the smile die on his face. Margaret slowly lowered her phone, mouth falling open. The guests stopped breathing. The poor, dirty, ragged boy, the cleaner's son who had stumbled through the wrong door, was playing like a virtuoso. But it was when James recognized the melody that his entire world came crashing down around him. Clair de Lune, William's favorite piece. The last piece his son had played on that very piano 7 years ago, 1 week before the accident that took him away forever. James felt his legs weaken. His hand shot out, grasping a nearby chair for support. His heart, that organ he swore had frozen solid years ago, began to crack. And Oliver kept playing, completely unaware that every single note was tearing open a wound that had never healed. The notes of Clair de Lune filled every corner of that ballroom, as if they were made of something beyond mere sound. There was an almost supernatural quality to the way the music spread, silencing not just voices, but the very thoughts of everyone who heard it. Oliver played with his eyes closed now. His small fingers danced across the keys with an intimacy that only comes from years of secret practice, of love cultivated in silence. He was no longer in Whitmore Manor. He was somewhere else entirely. A place where Italian suits and designer gowns didn't exist. A place where the only luxury was the sound itself. The entire ballroom seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. A woman in a silver gown pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart constrict without understanding why. A businessman who had been laughing at Oliver minutes earlier now had tears forming in his eyes. A socialite who had called the boy filthy let a single tear escape, ruining hours of expensive makeup. But no one was paying attention to her. No one was paying attention to anything except that boy and that piano. Margaret Whitmore stood frozen, her phone still raised, but completely forgotten. Her mouth hung slightly open, forming an expression that mixed shock with something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Something close to reverence, and James Whitmore was being destroyed from the inside out. He couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from the child at the piano bench. Every note that flowed from that instrument was like a knife, twisting in a wound he thought he'd cauterized with work, money, and calculated coldness. Claire de Lune. The melody began playing in his memory alongside the piano. But it wasn't Oliver he was seeing. It was William. His William. Chestnut hair falling across his forehead as he concentrated, slender fingers running across the keys with the same impossible fluidity, the same closing of eyes when the music carried him away. James felt his throat close. His hands began to tremble. 7 years. It had been 7 years since anyone had played that piano. After the accident, James had forbidden anyone from going near the instrument. He'd considered selling it, destroying it, but couldn't bring himself to do it. The piano was the last thing that still held his son's fingerprints, the last proof that William had existed, and now a stranger's child was making that piano sing again. Oliver reached a more delicate passage in the piece. His hands slowed their rhythm, his fingers caressing the keys, as if asking permission for each note. The sound became softer, more intimate, like a whispered conversation between old friends. A memory invaded James's mind with brutal force. It was a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks before the accident. William was sitting on that same bench, playing this same piece. James had come home after a business trip and stopped at the doorway just watching. William hadn't noticed his father's presence. When he finished, James applauded. William spun around, startled, then broke into an enormous smile. "Dad, you heard?" "I heard, son. It was beautiful. It's Debussy, Claire de Lune. It means moonlight in French. My teacher says I play better than some of his adult students." "I'm sure you do." William had jumped up and run to embrace his father. James remembered the smell of children's shampoo, the warmth of that small body against his, the excited voice talking about scales and chords. "Dad, one day I'm going to play in a big theatre, one of those with thousands of people watching, and you'll be in the front row. You can count on it, champion." But he never was. There was never a theatre, never a front row. 3 weeks later, a driver ran a red light. James blinked, returning to the present. His eyes were burning. When was the last time he had cried? He couldn't remember. Perhaps at the funeral. Perhaps not even then, because he'd needed to maintain appearances. But now he was breaking. Right there, in the middle of his own party, surrounded by distinguished guests, he was crumbling because of a boy he had mocked mere minutes ago. Oliver's fingers found a crescendo in the music, the notes swelling with an emotion that seemed far too large for such a small child to contain. The melody rose and fell like waves against a shore, each phrase building upon the last, until the music seemed to fill not just the room, but the very souls of everyone present. An elderly man in the corner wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. A young waiter who had stopped mid-service stood transfixed, champagne forgotten on his tray. Then Oliver began the final passage of the piece. His fingers moved with exquisite delicacy, each note placed with the precision of a master craftsman, laying the final stones of a cathedral. The music grew quieter, more tender, as if saying goodbye to something precious, as if letting go. The last note hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. Then silence. Not the mocking silence from before. This was something entirely different. This silence had weight. It was full, overflowing with something no one could name. Oliver opened his eyes slowly. For a few seconds, there was nothing but that profound, trembling quiet. Then a single person began to applaud. It was an elderly gentleman standing near the far wall, one of the few guests who hadn't laughed at Oliver. He clapped slowly, deliberately, tears streaming down his weathered face. Soon another person joined, then another, and another. Within moments, the entire ballroom was applauding. These weren't the polite, restrained claps that wealthy people offer at social events. These were real applause, hands striking together with genuine emotion, coming from the chest rather than mere courtesy. Oliver looked around, confused. He hadn't expected this. He'd expected more laughter, more humiliation, more jokes about the cleaner's son. But what he saw were moved faces, wet eyes, genuine smiles directed at him. For the first time that night, he didn't feel the urge to run. That was when the service door burst open with a bang. Grace Sullivan stumbled into the ballroom, still wearing her cleaning uniform. Her face was pale as chalk, her eyes wide with panic. She'd heard the commotion and come running from upstairs, terrified of what might be happening to her son. "Oliver!" Her voice cut through the applause like a blade. The boy rose from the piano bench, his face lighting up when he saw his mother. "Mum, did you hear? I played the man's piano!" Grace rushed to him, grabbing his arm with trembling hands. Her eyes swept across the ballroom with terror, expecting to find security guards ready to drag them away, or worse. "For God's sake, child, what have you done? I told you to stay in the back room." Her voice shook, mixing fear and relief. "I'm so sorry, everyone, so sorry. He's just a boy, he doesn't know any better. Please don't call the police." "Mum, calm down." Oliver tried to soothe her, but Grace wasn't listening. She turned toward where James stood, ready to beg. But when her eyes found the face of the master of the house, she stopped cold. James Whitmore, the most powerful man in this city, the businessman who made government ministers tremble, was crying, not discreetly, as would be expected from someone of his position. He was truly crying. Fat tears rolled down his face, and he wasn't even bothering to wipe them away. Grace didn't understand. She looked at the other guests seeking an explanation, but found only faces as confused as her own. Margaret approached her husband, touching his arm with hesitation. "James, darling, are you all right?" He didn't respond. He kept staring at Oliver as if he were seeing a ghost. The silence that fell now was different from before. It wasn't the awed silence of music. It was an uncomfortable silence, loaded with questions no one dared to ask. Oliver released his mother's hand and took a step toward James. There was something in that man's eyes that the boy recognized. He saw that same look every time his mother thought he was sleeping and let her tears fall. It was the look of someone carrying a pain too large to fit inside their chest. "Sir?" Oliver's voice was soft, careful. "Are you okay?" James blinked, as if waking from a trance. He looked at the boy standing before him. So small, so fragile, so completely unaware of the earthquake he had caused. "Where?" James's voice came out hoarse, broken. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Where did you learn that piece?" "My grandfather taught me. Pop. He used to tune pianos in rich people's houses. Sometimes he'd take me along and let me play a little when no one was watching." "Your grandfather? Does he still teach you?" Oliver lowered his eyes. "My grandfather passed away 2 years ago, but I still remember everything he taught me. I play so I don't forget his voice." James felt the air leave his lungs. Another child who had lost someone, another family torn apart, and there he'd been minutes earlier, mocking this boy as if he were nothing. "Why that piece?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why that one specifically?" Oliver shrugged, with the simplicity of someone who didn't understand the weight of the question. It was my grandfather's favorite. He used to say this piece speaks about missing someone, about loving someone who isn't close anymore, about finding light in the middle of darkness. James closed his eyes. The boy's words pierced something deep inside him that had been dormant for years. Light in the middle of darkness. That was exactly how William used to describe the music, with the same words. As if there were some invisible connection between this unknown child and the son he had lost. Grace pulled Oliver back, still frightened. "Sir, please forgive us for any trouble. We'll leave now. We don't want any problems." "Wait." James raised his hand. "Don't go anywhere." The tone of his voice made Grace freeze. She pulled Oliver close against her, prepared for the worst. But the worst didn't come. James walked slowly toward where mother and son stood. Each step seemed to cost enormous effort, as if he were walking through deep water. When he reached them, he lowered himself to Oliver's height. The guests watched in absolute silence. No one dared move. "What's your name, son?" James's voice was different now, softer, almost human. "Oliver. Oliver Sullivan." "Oliver." James repeated the name as if tasting the sound. "You know I offered you $10 million if you played, don't you?" Oliver nodded, eyes wide. "Well, then—" James straightened up, adjusting his suit jacket. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the entire ballroom. "I am a man of my word. Tomorrow morning, $10 million will be in your mother's account." Grace nearly fainted. She grabbed Oliver's shoulder to keep from falling. "Sir, you can't be serious." "I'm always serious, madam." James looked at her for the first time. "Especially when it comes to debts. And I owe far more than $10 million to this boy." No one understood what he meant. Not Margaret, who had known her husband for 23 years. Not the business partners who had dealt with him for decades. Not the guests who thought they knew everything about James Whitmore. But Oliver understood. Not the words, but the feeling behind them. He understood that this man in his expensive suit and Italian leather shoes was just as broken inside as he and his mother were on the outside. "Sir!" Oliver called out before James could walk away. "Yes? You lost someone too, didn't you?" The simple question from a child made James Whitmore, the ruthless businessman, the man who never showed weakness, collapse completely. He didn't answer. He just looked at Oliver with eyes full of a pain he had hidden from the world for 7 years. Then he turned and walked out of the ballroom with quick steps, leaving behind a silent party and 100 unanswered questions. Margaret tried to follow him, but he raised his hand without turning. "Leave me alone." She stopped in the middle of the room, humiliated in front of all their guests. Grace hugged Oliver tightly, not understanding anything that had happened, but grateful to still be standing. Grateful her son was safe. Grateful that somehow, mysteriously, the night had ended differently than she'd feared. Oliver returned the embrace, but his eyes remained fixed on the door through which James had disappeared. Something had changed in that man, something profound. And even at just 9 years old, Oliver sensed that this would not be the last time their paths would cross. The Steinway grand piano sat silent in the center of the ballroom, but for the first time in 7 years, it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a bridge. And Oliver had no idea that crossing it would change not just one life, but 3, including his own. James Whitmore didn't sleep that night. After fleeing his own party, he locked himself in his study and sat in darkness for hours. The bottle of scotch on his desk remained untouched. He didn't want to numb what he was feeling. For the first time in 7 years, he wanted to feel everything. Every stab of pain, every memory, every drop of grief he had buried beneath contracts and numbers that never meant anything. William, his boy, his only child, who preferred musical scales to financial spreadsheets, who dreamed of playing in packed theaters while James dreamed of seeing him run the family empire. 11 years old. William had been just 11 when the driver ran that red light. James closed his eyes and let the memories come. The phone call from the hospital, the sprint through white corridors, the doctor shaking his head, the small body beneath a white sheet. After that day, James Whitmore died alongside his son. The man who remained was merely a shell, a ghost in an Italian suit who signed contracts and accumulated a fortune that served no purpose. Margaret had tried to comfort him in those first months. But James's pain was a wall no one could breach. Eventually she stopped trying. Their marriage became a cold formality, and the piano stayed silent. A monument to what was lost, until tonight, until that boy. When dawn broke, James had made a decision. He picked up his phone and called his personal assistant. "David, I need you to find out everything about a family, Grace Sullivan and her son Oliver. She worked as a cleaner at last night's event. I want address, background, financial situation, everything. And I want it today." 3 hours later, a thick envelope sat on his desk. James opened it and began reading. With each page, his stomach sank deeper. Grace Sullivan, 34 years old, single mother, worked 3 separate cleaning jobs, woke at 4 in the morning, and rarely returned home before 10 at night. Lived with her son in public housing in Western Sydney. Oliver's father had abandoned them when the boy was still a baby. Never appeared again. Never sent a single dollar. And there was more. Grace was sick. A tumor growing silently while she worked herself to exhaustion. The doctors said she needed treatment urgently, but the public hospital waiting list stretched for months. Months she might not have. James found a photograph attached to the report. Oliver at a train station, sitting on a milk crate, playing a broken toy keyboard, missing several keys. In front of him, a small plastic container with a few coins. The caption said he did this every afternoon after school, trying to collect money for his mother's medicine. 9 years old. The boy was 9 years old, and already carrying the weight of an adult on his shoulders. James pushed the papers away and covered his face with his hands. What kind of monster had he become? He had mocked that child in front of hundreds of people, turned his suffering into entertainment, laughed while Oliver fought battles no child should ever face. The study door swung open without warning. Margaret stormed in, her posture rigid, ready for war. She hadn't slept either, but for entirely different reasons. Her face was a mask of controlled fury. "James, we need to talk about last night." He didn't look up. "Not now, Margaret." "Yes, now." She slammed the door behind her and crossed her arms. "You humiliated me in front of every important person in Sydney. You ran out crying like a child because of some street urchin playing our piano. People are talking. They're laughing at us. Let them laugh." "Let them laugh?" Her voice rose an octave. "You have a reputation to maintain. We have an image. And you want to throw it all away because of a cleaner? And her son?" James finally looked at her. There was something different in his eyes, something Margaret didn't recognize. That boy played William's music. Margaret stepped back as if slapped. "What does that have to do with anything? William is gone, James. He's been gone for 7 years. You need to move past this." "Move past it." James stood slowly. "You want me to move past the death of my son?" "Our son," Margaret corrected, but her voice held no emotion. "And yes, I moved past it, because the alternative was losing my mind. You chose to lose yours instead. You chose to drown in that grief and drag everyone down with you. You never truly loved William." The words escaped before James could stop them. But now that they hung in the air, he realized he had always known this truth. Margaret had loved the idea of having a child, the status, but she had never loved the quiet boy who preferred piano to social events. Margaret's face went white with rage. "How dare you say that to me?" "Because it's true, and I was too much of a coward to admit it all these years." The silence between them could have cut glass. 23 years of marriage crumbling in seconds. "What are you planning to do?" Margaret asked finally, her voice ice cold. "I'm going to help that family. With the 10 million? James, you cannot be serious. It was a joke. Everyone understood it was a joke. It wasn't a joke to me, and it won't be a joke to them. Margaret let out a bitter laugh. You've completely lost your mind. I'm calling our lawyer. Call whoever you want, but the money is mine, and I'll do whatever I choose with it. She stormed out, slamming the door so hard the paintings on the wall trembled. James stood motionless for a moment, processing what had just happened. His marriage was over. Perhaps it had always been over, and he simply hadn't wanted to see it. But now it didn't matter. He had something more important to do. He grabbed his car keys and left. The address led him to a part of Sydney he had never visited. The streets were cracked and potholed, making his imported car shake. The houses were modest flats, crowded together, as if leaning on each other for support. Children playing barefoot stopped to stare at the car that didn't belong. James parked in front of the address and felt his stomach turn. It was smaller than he had imagined. Weathered brick walls, a door that didn't close properly, windows with cracks patched by tape. He took a deep breath and knocked. Light footsteps approached. The door opened a few centimeters, and Oliver's eyes appeared in the gap. "Sir," the boy seemed surprised but not frightened. "What are you doing here?" "I came to speak with you and your mother. May I come in?" Oliver hesitated, then opened the door fully. The interior was even smaller than it looked from outside. One room served as living area, kitchen, and bedroom. There was a single bed against the wall where Grace lay, covered by a thin blanket. She tried to sit up when she saw who it was, but Oliver ran to her. "Easy, Mum. The doctor said you need to rest." "Oliver, we can't receive visitors like this. Look at the mess." Her voice was weak, her face pale. "Please don't worry about that, ma'am." James stepped inside carefully, trying not to show the shock he felt. "I'm the one who should apologize for appearing without warning." Grace looked at him with a mixture of confusion and fear. "Have you come to take back the money?" "Because we haven't touched anything. We came straight home from the party." "No, ma'am. I've actually come to deliver it." He pulled an envelope from his pocket and placed it on the small table in the center of the room. "This is the transfer confirmation. $10 million. They're already in the account my assistant opened in your name this morning." Grace's eyes went wide. Oliver stood frozen. "Sir, you're actually serious?" "Completely serious. A promise is a promise." Grace began to cry, silent tears streaming down her thin, exhausted face. "Why, we're nothing to you. I'm just a cleaner. My son is just—" "Your son is extraordinary," James interrupted. "And you're a mother who works herself sick to give him a better life. That's not being nothing. That's being everything." Oliver looked at the envelope on the table, then at James, then at his mother. His eyes were serious, far too serious for a child of 9. "Sir, we can't accept this." James blinked, surprised. "What do you mean you can't accept it?" "My grandfather always said that charity fills the belly, but empties the soul." Oliver spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. "You're giving this money because you felt sorry for us, because you saw where we live and felt guilty. I don't want guilt money. I want my mum to be proud of me." James felt as if he'd been punched. For the second time in 2 days, this child had completely disarmed him. "Oliver?" Grace tried to intervene, but her son continued. "You cried when I played that song. It wasn't because of the piano. It was because of something else. Someone." Oliver's eyes met James's directly. "You lost someone who played piano too, didn't you?" The silence that followed was deafening. James felt his legs weaken. He looked for somewhere to sit, but there was nowhere. He ended up leaning against the wall, breathing deeply to keep from falling apart in front of this child again. "My son." The words came out like shards of glass. "I lost my son. William. He was 11 years old. He played piano just like you. Claire de Lune was his favorite piece." Oliver nodded slowly as if he had already known. "And that's why you want to give us money? To feel better about yourself?" James closed his eyes. The brutal honesty of this child was like a mirror, showing truths he didn't want to see. "Perhaps," he admitted, "perhaps I thought that by giving this money I could, I don't know, make up for something." "Make up for what?" "All the years I spent being the worst kind of person. Rich, arrogant, thinking money solved everything. While my son was alive, I worked too much and spent too little time with him. After he died, I became even worse, as if punishing the world would lessen my pain. Grace watched the conversation in silence, tears still flowing. Oliver walked to James and stopped right in front of him. So small, so fragile, but with a strength in his eyes that grown men didn't possess. My grandfather said that money is like water. It can quench thirst or it can drown, depends on how you use it. Your grandfather was a wise man. He was. Oliver smiled for the first time. He also said that good people sometimes do bad things, and bad people sometimes do good things. What matters is what we choose to do next. James looked at this boy and saw something unexpected. He didn't see William. He didn't see a projection of his lost son. He saw Oliver, a different person with his own story, his own pain, his own strength. "What do you suggest I do then?" James asked, genuinely wanting to know. Oliver thought for a moment. "Don't give guilt money. Give real opportunity. My mum is a hard worker, not a charity case. She just needs a chance she's never had." James looked at Grace, who was trying to hide her embarrassed face. "Mrs. Sullivan, what did you do before cleaning?" Grace wiped her tears, surprised by the question. Before I got sick, I worked in an office. I know computers, filing, answering phones. But after I started feeling unwell, no one would hire me anymore." An idea began forming in James's mind. Not charity, something different. Something that might just possibly begin to repair the man he had become. What if I offered you a real job, with salary, benefits, health insurance that covers your treatment? Grace blinked, not understanding. "A job? For me? At my company. Starting next week, if you accept." Oliver looked at his mother, then at James. For the first time there was hope in his eyes. "That's not charity, Mum. That's work." Grace looked at her son, then at the man who had humiliated them the night before and was now offering a chance to start over. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked quietly. James took a deep breath before answering. "Because your son reminded me of something I had forgotten, that there's more than one way to die, and I've been dying slowly for 7 years. He looked at Oliver. "But maybe there's still time to start living again." Grace accepted the job, and the $10 million remained untouched, a promise kept, waiting for the day when Oliver would decide what to do with it. But neither of them knew that the hardest tests were still to come. 2 months had passed since the night that changed everything. Grace Sullivan was a different woman now. Not on the outside. Though she had gained some weight back, some color in her cheeks, the real transformation was inside. She walked with the posture of someone who could finally look at the future without fear of it disappearing. The job at Whitmore Industries had become more than just work. Grace discovered she had a talent for organization, for handling people, for solving problems that seemed impossible. In 2 months, she had already been promoted once. Not because of favor from anyone, because of her own merit. Oliver had started at his new school, one of the best in Sydney, paid for by James. At first, Grace had refused, but Oliver convinced her. "Mum, it's not charity. It's investment. Mr. Whitmore said he wants to see what I become." The new school was another world entirely. Air-conditioned classrooms, computers for every student, teachers who didn't need to shout to be heard, and a music room with real instruments, including a baby grand piano that Oliver looked at as if it were made of pure gold. In the first week, he spoke to no one, sat at the back of the classroom, observing. The other students either ignored him or, worse, made jokes about his clothes that were still too simple for that environment. But then came the music lesson. The teacher asked for volunteers to play something on the piano. No one moved. The wealthy children had private lessons in everything except the humility to expose themselves in front of others. Oliver raised his hand. The teacher frowned, surprised. This was the new boy, the scholarship student, the one everyone whispered was only there because of charity from the company owner. "Come up then, Oliver." He walked to the piano under curious stares and a few muffled laughs, sat on the bench, adjusted his posture the way Pop had taught him, and closed his eyes for a moment. When he began to play, the entire room fell silent. It wasn't Clair de Lune this time. It was Für Elise by Beethoven, a piece his grandfather said was perfect for showing that talent has no address. Oliver's fingers danced across the keys with the same confidence he had shown at Whitmore Manor, each note precise, felt, alive. When he finished, no one laughed, no one made jokes. The teacher's mouth hung open, and a girl in the front row had tears in her eyes. From that day forward, Oliver was no longer the pitiful scholarship kid. He became the piano boy, the prodigy, the one who made music seem like magic. It was also that week when the announcement came. The Australian National Young Pianists Festival, the most prestigious competition for musicians under 15 in the entire country. The finals would be held at the Sydney Opera House in 3 months. Thousands of young talents would compete. Only 12 would reach the final stage. Oliver's music teacher pulled him aside after class. "Oliver, I've submitted your name for the competition. I believe you have a real chance." Oliver felt his heart race. The Sydney Opera House, the same stage where the greatest pianists in the world had performed, where his grandfather had dreamed of seeing him play one day. "But I should warn you," the teacher continued, "the competition will be fierce, especially because Sebastian Reed is competing." "Who's Sebastian Reed?" "He's 12 years old, son of Marcus Reed." Oliver recognized the name. Marcus Reed was one of the biggest real estate developers in Australia, and also one of James Whitmore's fiercest business rivals. The two had been enemies for decades, fighting over contracts and land across the country. "Sebastian has been trained by the best teachers money can buy since he was 4, the teacher explained. "He's won every competition he's entered. Some people are already calling him the best young pianist in Australian history." Oliver swallowed hard but didn't look away. "I'll do my best, sir." What Oliver didn't know was that Sebastian had already heard about him. News of the scholarship boy who had made a billionaire cry at his own party had spread through Sydney's elite circles, and Sebastian didn't like competition, especially not from someone he considered beneath him. The following weeks were a whirlwind of practice and preparation. James arranged for a Steinway to be delivered to Oliver's home, not as a gift, as a loan, Oliver insisted. The boy practiced 4 hours every day after school, his fingers building calluses, his repertoire expanding. James visited often, at first just to check on their progress. But gradually, something deeper began to form. He would sit in the small living room listening to Oliver play, and sometimes tears would fall without him noticing. Not tears of sadness anymore, tears of something new, something like healing. One evening, after Oliver finished a particularly moving piece, James spoke quietly. "William never had the chance to compete. He always talked about it, dreamed about playing at the Opera House. But I was always too busy to take him to auditions. I thought there would be time later." He paused, his voice catching. "There wasn't." Oliver stopped playing and turned to face him. "Mr. Whitmore, I can't bring William back. No one can. But maybe I can play for him too. When I'm on that stage, I'll play for my grandfather. And for William. For everyone who loved music but never got the chance to show the world." James couldn't speak. He simply nodded, tears streaming down his face. Everything was going so well. Too well. 3 weeks before the competition, Grace collapsed at work. Oliver was at school when he got the call. James himself came to pick him up, his face pale, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. "What happened?" Oliver demanded, his voice shaking. "Is my mum okay?" "The tumor," James said quietly. "It's grown faster than the doctors expected. She needs emergency surgery, Oliver. Tonight." The world stopped spinning. Oliver felt the air leave his lungs. His mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, who had worked 3 jobs while hiding her pain, who had never once complained, was fighting for her life. At the hospital, Oliver sat alone in the corridor outside the intensive care unit. He was curled into a plastic chair, his eyes red, his hands trembling. When James found him, the boy looked up with an expression that shattered the older man's heart. "What if she doesn't wake up?" Oliver whispered. "What if I lose her too?" James knelt in front of him, placing both hands on the boy's shoulders. "Listen to me, Oliver. Your mother is the strongest person I've ever known. She's been fighting impossible battles her whole life, and she's won every single one. She's not going to stop now. You don't know that." "No, I don't. But I know this. I'm going to bring the best surgeons in Australia to this hospital. Cost doesn't matter. Nothing matters except saving her." Oliver looked at him with eyes too old for a 9-year-old. "Why? Why do you care so much about us?" James felt his throat tighten. "Because you gave me something $10 million couldn't buy. You gave me hope. You gave me a reason to stop dying and start living again." He paused, struggling for control. "And because in these past 2 months, you and your mother have become family. The family I forgot how to be part of." Oliver stared at him for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He threw his small arms around James and held on tight. For the first time in 7 years, James Whitmore embraced someone like a father. In the hours that followed, James made more phone calls than he had made in months, called in every favor accumulated over decades of business, pressured, insisted, practically begged, and when all else failed, offered money, whatever it took. By midnight, 3 of the country's leading oncological surgeons had arrived at the hospital. The surgery began at 2 in the morning. Oliver refused to sleep. He sat in the waiting room with James beside him, neither speaking much. Sometimes Oliver would close his eyes and move his fingers in the air, playing invisible keys. "What are you playing?" James asked once. "Claire de Lune. It's the piece Mum likes best. She says it helps her relax when she's scared." James closed his eyes, remembering William saying almost the exact same thing. "My son used to play it for me when I came home stressed from work. I complained about the noise sometimes." He shook his head slowly. "I'd give anything to hear that noise again." "When Mum gets better," Oliver said, "I'll play it for you every day if you want." James smiled through his tears. "I'd like that very much." The sun was rising over Sydney when the lead surgeon finally appeared in the doorway. Oliver and James jumped to their feet simultaneously, hearts pounding. The doctor looked exhausted, but there was a faint smile on his face. "The surgery was successful. We removed the entire tumor. She'll need time to recover, but the prognosis is excellent." Oliver felt his legs give way. James caught him before he hit the ground. "She's going to be okay?" the boy asked, barely able to speak. "She's going to be okay." Oliver finally let himself cry. Not the silent tears he'd learned to hide. Real crying, loud and messy and full of relief. James held him through all of it, his own tears falling freely. When Grace woke hours later, the first thing she saw was Oliver sitting beside her bed, holding her hand. "Hey, Mum," his voice cracked. "Welcome back." Grace tried to smile, though she was still weak from the anesthesia. "The competition," she whispered. "It's in 3 weeks." "Mum, I don't care about the competition. I almost lost you." "No." Her voice was faint but firm. "Oliver, listen to me. I didn't fight my whole life for you to give up now. You're going to compete. You're going to walk onto that stage and show everyone what you're made of." "Mum, I can't leave you." Grace squeezed his hand with whatever strength she had. "I'll be watching. Even if it's from this bed, I'll be watching. Your grandfather will be watching too. And that boy, William, he'll be watching." Her eyes moved to James, standing quietly by the door. "You play for all of us, Oliver. You play for everyone who believed in you." Oliver looked at James, then back at his mother. "I'm scared, Mum. Sebastian Reed has been training his whole life. He has the best teachers, the best everything. You're just what?" Grace interrupted, her eyes flashing with sudden fire. "The boy who made a billionaire cry with his music? The boy who plays with his heart instead of just his fingers? Oliver, you have something no amount of money can buy. You have soul. Don't you ever forget that." James stepped forward. "She's right, Oliver. Sebastian Reed might have technique, but you have something more. You have a story. You have pain. You have love. And when you sit at that piano, all of it comes through. That's why people cry when they hear you play. Not because of the notes, because of what's behind them." Oliver looked at both of them, his mother lying in a hospital bed after nearly dying, and the man who had gone from enemy to family in just 2 months. He wiped his tears and stood up straight. "Okay, I'll compete." Grace smiled, exhausted but proud. "That's my boy." "But I'm not playing for the prize," Oliver added. "I'm playing for you, Mum, for Pop, for William." He looked at James. "For everyone who deserves to hear music made from love instead of money." James nodded, unable to speak. In 3 weeks, Oliver would walk onto the stage of the Sydney Opera House. 500 people in the audience. Sebastian Reed waiting to crush him. But Oliver Sullivan was no longer afraid. He had already faced something far more terrifying than any competition, and he had won. The Sydney Opera House rose against the morning sky like a ship made of white sails, its iconic curves catching the golden light of dawn. Oliver had seen pictures of this building his entire life, but standing before it now, he felt smaller than ever. 3 weeks had passed since his mother's surgery. 3 weeks of practice, of worry, of sleepless nights wondering if he was good enough. Today would answer that question. James stood beside him, dressed in a simple grey suit, nothing like the flashy Italian designs he used to wear. The divorce papers from Margaret had been signed and filed the previous month. She had taken half of everything and moved to Melbourne without looking back. James hadn't fought it. There was nothing left between them worth fighting for. The only thing that mattered now was standing right beside him. "Nervous?" James asked. Oliver nodded, his throat too tight for words. "Good. That means you care." James placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. William was always nervous before his recitals. He used to say the butterflies in his stomach were just the music trying to get out. Oliver smiled despite himself. Pop used to say something similar. He said nerves are just excitement wearing a disguise. Wise men? Both of them? They walked toward the entrance together, joining the stream of families and young musicians filing into the building. The Australian National Young Pianists Festival had drawn competitors from every corner of the country. 12 finalists, 1 stage, and 500 people waiting inside to witness who would emerge victorious. Oliver spotted Sebastian Reed before they even entered the main hall. The boy was hard to miss. 12 years old, impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit, surrounded by a team that included a personal coach, a nutritionist, and what appeared to be a media handler. His father, Marcus Reed, stood nearby, speaking loudly into his phone about brand opportunities and sponsorship deals. Sebastian's eyes found Oliver across the crowd. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He walked over, his entourage parting like water around him. "So, you're the charity case everyone's been talking about." Sebastian's voice dripped with contempt. "The cleaner's son who made old Whitmore cry at his party." Oliver said nothing, just met his gaze steadily. "I've heard you play by ear. No formal training. No real technique." Sebastian laughed. "This isn't some train station where people throw coins at you. This is the Opera House. You're going to embarrass yourself in front of the whole country." James stepped forward, but Oliver raised his hand slightly, a gesture that said, "I've got this." "My grandfather taught me that music isn't about technique," Oliver said quietly. "It's about truth. And the truest music comes from people who've actually lived, not people who've just practiced." Sebastian's smile flickered. For just a moment something uncertain passed through his eyes. Then the arrogance returned. "We'll see about that, train station boy." He walked away, his team hurrying after him. James looked at Oliver with newfound respect. "Where did that come from?" "Pop," Oliver shrugged. "He always said bullies are just scared people pretending to be brave." They made their way into the concert hall, and Oliver's breath caught in his throat. The space was magnificent. Rows upon rows of red velvet seats curved around a central stage where a Steinway concert grand waited under soft spotlights. The ceiling soared overhead, designed to carry sound in ways that made every note feel alive. 500 seats, and nearly all of them were already filled. James guided Oliver backstage, where the other finalists were warming up. Some paced nervously. Others sat with headphones, lost in their own worlds. The air was thick with tension and ambition. A production assistant approached with a clipboard. "Oliver Sullivan, you're performing 11th. Sebastian Reed is 10th. Oliver nodded. Going after Sebastian meant the audience would compare them directly. Every strength, every weakness laid bare. The competition began. One by one, the young pianists took the stage. Some were technically brilliant but emotionally flat. Others played with passion but stumbled over difficult passages. The audience applauded politely after each performance, but Oliver could sense they were waiting for something more, something that would move them. Sebastian Reed was called to the stage. He walked out with the confidence of someone who had never known failure, sat at the piano without hesitation, adjusted the bench with precise, practiced movements. Then he began to play. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. Sebastian's fingers flew across the keys with mechanical precision, hitting every note exactly as written. His technique was flawless, his timing impeccable. The audience watched in awe as he navigated passages that would have defeated pianists twice his age. When he finished, the applause was thunderous, standing ovation. People were already whispering that they had witnessed the winner. Sebastian bowed deeply, a satisfied smile on his face. As he walked off stage, he passed Oliver and whispered, "Follow that train station, boy." Oliver stood in the wings, his heart pounding. Sebastian had been perfect. Absolutely, technically, undeniably perfect. But something had been missing. Oliver had felt it. The music had been impressive, but it hadn't made anyone cry. It hadn't touched the soul. "Oliver Sullivan, please take the stage." He walked out into the lights. The audience saw a small boy in simple clothes, not the expensive suit his competitors wore. His shoes were clean but ordinary. His hair was neatly combed but not styled. He looked exactly like what he was, a child from public housing who had no business being on this stage. Oliver sat at the piano and looked out at the sea of faces. And then he saw them. In the front row, directly center, sat James Whitmore. Tears were already forming in his eyes. Beside him was an empty seat with a small framed photograph resting on it. William. James had brought his son to finally see the concert he'd always dreamed of. And next to that, in a wheelchair with a blanket over her lap, sat Grace Sullivan. Oliver's heart stopped. His mother was supposed to be in the hospital. The doctors had said she needed at least another week of rest. But there she was, pale and thin, but smiling, her eyes shining with pride and love. She raised her hand slightly and mouthed 2 words, "Play, baby." Oliver felt tears prick his eyes. He looked at the photograph of William, at James, who was openly weeping now, at his mother, who had fought through pain and weakness just to be here. He thought of Pop watching from somewhere beyond. Then Oliver closed his eyes and placed his fingers on the keys. He began with Claire de Lune, the same piece that had started everything, the same melody that had shattered James Whitmore's walls and brought him to his knees at his own party. But this time, Oliver played it differently, slower, more intimate, as if he were having a private conversation with everyone he had ever loved and lost. The audience fell silent, not the polite silence of appreciation, but the profound silence of people who had forgotten how to breathe. A woman in the 3rd row pressed her hand to her mouth. An elderly man closed his eyes, tears streaming down his weathered face. Even the judges, trained to remain impartial, were visibly moved. Then, without pause, Oliver transitioned into something unexpected, his own composition, a piece he had written during the 3 weeks his mother was recovering. He called it "For Those Who Wait," a meditation on hope, on patience, on the love that sustains us through the darkest nights. The melody started soft and uncertain, like a child taking first steps. Then it grew, building through passages of struggle and pain, through moments of despair that felt almost unbearable. But always underneath there was a thread of light, a promise that dawn would come. The music swelled to a crescendo that seemed to fill not just the concert hall but the very souls of everyone present. Oliver's fingers moved with a passion that transcended technique, that went beyond anything that could be taught or learned. This was music born from a life of hardship, of loss, of love that refused to die. The final notes hung in the air like a prayer. Then silence. For 3 eternal seconds, no one moved. Then the opera house exploded. 500 people rose to their feet as one. The applause was deafening, primal, coming from somewhere deeper than mere appreciation. People were crying openly, strangers embraced each other. Even Sebastian Reed, standing in the wings, had gone pale. The judges didn't need to deliberate. The decision was unanimous. Oliver Sullivan had won, but the boy at the piano wasn't thinking about trophies or prizes. He was looking at his mother, who was sobbing with joy. At James, who stood with his hand over his heart, finally at peace. At the photograph of William, who had gotten his concert at last. Later, after the ceremony and the photographs and the endless congratulations, Oliver found himself alone with James and Grace in a quiet corner backstage. "So," James said, his voice still rough with emotion, "the $10 million. It's still sitting in that account, waiting for you to decide what to do with it." Oliver looked at his mother, then back at James. "I know what I want to do," he said. "I want to build a music school for kids like me. Kids who don't have pianos at home, who can't afford lessons, who think that music isn't for people like them." He paused. "I want to call it the William and Pop Music Academy." James's breath caught. Grace covered her mouth with trembling hands. "I want every kid who walks through those doors to know that it doesn't matter where you come from," Oliver continued. "Talent doesn't have an address. Music doesn't check your bank account. And sometimes the people with the least are the ones with the most to give." James knelt down to Oliver's level, just as he had done that first night in the small flat. "William would have loved that," he whispered, "and your grandfather would be so proud." "I know," Oliver smiled. "They're both watching. I can feel it." Grace reached out and pulled her son into a fierce embrace. James wrapped his arms around both of them, and for a long moment the 3 of them stood together, a family forged not by blood, but by something stronger, by music, by loss, by love that chose to heal instead of break. Outside the opera house, the sun was setting over Sydney Harbour, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Oliver walked between his mother and James, feeling lighter than he had ever felt in his life. "You know what Pop always said?" Oliver asked. "What?" Grace and James answered together. "He said the richest people aren't the ones with the most money. They're the ones with the most love, the ones who give more than they take, the ones who make the world a little more beautiful just by being in it." He looked up at the opera house, its white sails glowing in the fading light. "Tonight, I think I finally understand what he meant." James smiled through his tears. "Your grandfather was the wisest man who ever lived." "He was," Oliver agreed. "And so was William. They just never got the chance to show the world." He took a deep breath of the evening air. "But I did, and I played for all of us." They walked toward the car, 3 people who had started as strangers and ended as family. Behind them, the opera house stood silent, holding the echoes of music that had changed everything. And somewhere, in a place beyond sight but not beyond feeling, 2 souls who loved piano smiled down at a boy who had given them both a voice. The true million was never in the bank account. It was in every note that made someone cry, every song that healed a broken heart, every child who would walk through the doors of the William and Pop Music Academy and discover that they too had music inside them. That was the fortune Oliver Sullivan had won, and it was worth more than all the money in the world.